just unbearable. Like, it's crap. Bad quality, bad writing. Disney held children's attention. For a while, they were good stewards of that attention. Like a lot of the entertainment industry, they've become captured by ideology. And ideology makes for boring stories. You always have to kind of look twice at what your kid is reading. You know, it's so insipid. There's people just trying to get into your child's mind. Sadly, Disney was just dropping these fairy tales. They were like, we don't want these. We actually don't like them anymore. And so I thought this would be a great time to do this.
Jonathan Pageau, welcome to my podcast.
It's great to see you again, Mikhaila.
How much do you think social media has to play in the last decade of weirdness? Like, I feel like in 2012, there were some, like, I was in university and you could kind of see some of the woke stuff coming into play. But because there wasn't such a strong online social media following for these things, they didn't blow up as fast. Do you think that's why we're seeing such ups and downs and like chaos and politics and things? Because like everybody can suddenly get kind of one certain idea and one way of thinking, and they're just spammed with that information.
That's right. I think that's the right way to see it, is that, you know, in a normal, like, let's say just 30 years ago or 20 years ago, you could watch the news and be funneled into a certain idea, or you could even be manipulated. I mean, it's not like propaganda is a new thing. It's something that's existed for a very long time. And so you could get kind of dragged into propaganda, but then, that would last a certain amount of time and you would move away from that, and then you would encounter other people and you would live your life, and there'd be a kind of organic reality where you're constantly surrounded by people that have different opinions, different ideas, different things that they value. But now what happens with the online world is that in some ways, again, like what I said before, is you can fall into one thread and then you can have massive reinforcement in that thread. You can find yourself surrounded by people online. You can find yourself surrounded by people who only agree with you and are completely in line with this one thing that you're aiming towards. So that's true for it's as true for kind of weird fetishistic thing, or little people who get obsessed by certain cultural let's say cultural niches, but then it also becomes true for political ideas as well, where people just get dragged into something, and people have become way easier to manipulate now with social media, for sure.
How do you specifically avoid being manipulated by social media? Like, do you ever find yourself thinking one way a little too strongly and you're like, maybe I need to see the other side? Or do you use like a moral compass? How do you figure it out?
I probably am manipulated sometimes, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. What I hope is that in some ways, similar to some of the things that your father has developed, that if you have a sense of how reality has a left and a right hand, you could say, and how, every movement in one direction hides something, a kind of ignorance of another movement in another direction. I think I kind of have an internal clock where when I see things going too far, when I see things getting pushed, my mind immediately reverts to asking, a question from the other perspective. And that is, on the one hand, it is definitely, I think, something valuable. It can sometimes work against you because people will accuse you of not taking strong positions on certain things that they think are important. And because that I tend to do that I always tend to look at a story and then try to embody it within the story, the different characters, and see things from different perspectives. It means that, I often don't take as strong positions as others have, in certain even political situations.
Yeah, I can see that.
Sometimes you actually need people who just see one direction. Like that's something that's very useful sometimes, because, when critical problems arise, you have to be able to filter out the other position, and you have to just be able, like, if you're being robbed on the street, that's not the time to ask yourself, if you can understand the world through the position of the person robbing you. You kind of have to react very quickly. So I think that there is value in not being able to do that. But myself, I tend to do that all the time.
Yeah, I think I tend to do that as well, and I think I get that wrong sometimes by seeing the other side's position a little bit too well. Being like, well, I can see how they got there. And like, sometimes it doesn't really matter how they got there or what the reasons are behind it if the place you end up is not a good place.
Happy Thanksgiving. Forget my gravelly voice. I'm getting over the plague given to me by, I think, my brother. But I'm surviving, and I want to make money, so I'm here reading ads. I hope your Thanksgiving was amazing. If you are feeling the hangover from Thanksgiving, or if you're preparing for the holidays, we're having a massive sale for After Party. The hangover supplement I made, it's 25% off from Black Friday, which is today, to Monday at midnight. This is great for stocking stuffers or gifts to prepare for New Year's and Christmas and the holidays. I'm not going to do another 25% off again because then my margins go so far down. It hurts me. So 25% off After Party. It also applies to subscription orders, so you can save more there. You can also use it if you've bought them already and just love them like I do. Fullerhealth.com, code BF, it's like Black Friday, 25 for 25% off. Linked in the comments. There's a money back guarantee, so you can give them a shot with no worries on refunds. It's so annoying when companies are annoying, so we're trying to not be annoying. Highly recommend giving these a shot, even if you only have the occasional drink, to help save your brain from the effects of alcohol. I hope your Thanksgiving was wonderful. Mine was. My parents are staying with us, so that's been fun. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
Yeah, ideally that would be the best. Would be to be able to play it out, and once you played it out, is to say, I think I can see all the positions of this, and now I think this is the morally superior. This is the best position to hold. I mean, I think that during the COVID stuff, at some point I could understand how people got caught up in the narrative and got caught up in the story and just got. But at some point I was like, no, like this is, it's like when the truckers came out, I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm going to Ottawa. It's like I just have to take a position, even though it's not popular, and even though I can understand why others are still in this kind of mind circle. But I had to take a position at that point.
Did you actually go? So you were there, you saw the protests?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It was great. And it just reinforced my vision that the media is absolutely corrupt in every way. This is something that actually started with me, with Jordan, with your father. It was the first time in 2016 that I was faced with, the narrative of someone I knew and that I talked to and that I exchanged with and that I had a sense of, and then seeing what the media were saying at the same time and thinking, they're lying. Like, they're just lying. They're just not telling the truth. And then since then, I've become more and more suspicious. And of course, during COVID, it just became insane. And when I was at the trucker protest, I mean, it was a protest. Obviously, it was a protest. But it's funny that the media portrayed it in such a crazy vision, when just a few years before, at the beginning of COVID, we literally had cities burning in the United States, people breaking down things, during the George Floyd protest. And now we had this protest where maybe a few things went wrong, maybe a few people exaggerated, but the media were showing them as basically a bunch of psycho Nazis, which was hilarious because that's not what was there.
Yeah, wild. I haven't trusted the media. I think my mind changed too when I started seeing like Dad portrayed as a really evil person. I was like, whoa, that's not even a twist on reality. That's just falsehood, which is scary. But I think all the media institutions are going to fade away into oblivion anyway, unless they adapt, which they don't seem to be. So they're probably old news.
Yeah, they seem to have tried to take on, like, you watch these news institutions try to take on Joe Rogan and treat him as if he's just a detail, just a blip. It's like, oh, this little comedian doing a podcast. It's just hilarious that they're so blind to what's actually happening.
Yeah. Okay, so I watched some clips from the recent debate. It was the Republican debate. And I don't know how up to date you are on American politics. Are you at all?
I did not watch anything.
I just watched the popular ones that were circulating around Instagram. I didn't actually watch the debate. Yeah. But I've seen quite a bit of what RFK is talking about, and he seems to be the person that's like in the middle, which is probably what my political stance is, more than conservative or liberal. And so I was watching a clip he did saying, the left has gone too far, the right has gone too far, and it's just part of the same monster with two heads, and they're fighting each other, and it's going to lead to the downfall of the US if we don't end up somewhere in the middle. And then, so I was like, yeah, I could stand behind that. But then, do you think because of the situation we're in the US and in Canada, there needs to be more pushback from the right to counteract what's happening with the left? Or do you think it's possible for somebody to come up in the middle and say, hey, you guys are both part of the problem. Let's try and go forward in the middle?
Yeah. I don't want to be a doomsayer, but I think it's too late.
Yeah.
At some point, it's like when the pendulum starts to swing, at some point you could say, well, I wish it was just stable, but it's coming at you. And so it's difficult because on the one hand, one side is pushing really hard for things that have become totally crazy, and when we talk about the whole problem of mutilating children with the whole transgender question, at some point you think, well, we have to push back, just for the sake of the life of these people. But then on the other side, they really feel like they're saving lives when they're doing it. So you have this pendulum that's swinging, and these things that are kind of going at full force at each other, and it's difficult to compromise. It's very difficult to compromise. So I can't see in the short term how it's going to settle. I think that there's a desire, possibly, and this is sad and tragic, to pull the attention away from this into something exterior, like a war, let's say, because that does it. Like if you have a war, then you bring people together. But that is also a very sad state of affairs. So I don't see a good way out of this. And I do feel like that's what's happening, is that, that there's a desire for war so that we can find some kind of median, and so, or at least some kind of common purpose that will prevent us from just ripping each other apart.
That's interesting. I haven't considered that. That seems right, though, because it is, I guess, when there's something as terrible as war, then people come together and go, okay. Although the current war, the most recent one.
It's dividing. Oh, it's dividing everybody.
It's insane. Yeah. I've never seen anything like it.
It's not. Yeah, it's not going to work. But, there was this idea that we could all get behind Ukraine, and if we could just all get behind Ukraine, then we'll be united. There's also, that's one of the reasons for the environmental apocalypticism is also this. It's like, I think a lot of it is anti-human and ridiculous, but you can kind of understand the drive behind it, because people say, well, if we could just all agree that we have to save the earth, then maybe we could just get along. Like this we could come together as a globe. You hear globalists say things like that this is ways to clump together as a globe. I recently heard from a WF panel where a woman was talking about how the next crisis will, or maybe should, be about water, because we can all agree on water, right? If there was a water crisis,
that's what we want.
Then we would all come together, and then we would come together as a globe. And even if you want to push it even in stranger directions, have you ever heard of Watchmen, the graphic novel Watchmen that came out in the 1980s? Well, that graphic novel is a great idea, which was, if you could fake an extraterrestrial attack, then you would all come together, And so it's like, you just need something outside of you that is like a common point of attention that joins you together. And, and in some ways, that is in some ways what hopefully people worshiping God should be doing, right? That's what that should be for, is the idea that there's something beyond you that is able to capture your attention, and that is able to be something that we can all have in common. Sadly, it has not always played that role, as we know, but that is ultimately what that should be for.
Yeah, I agree. How do you go to people? So I only started believing in God maybe 2 years ago, and we had a conversation since then. And before that, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I didn't understand what it was. And I didn't understand what people meant when they said they believed in God. It's like, I don't even know what that means. Have you found a way to talk to people who are like agnostic, or atheist might be even too far, but like agnostic, who are trying to grasp the concept of God? Have you figured out how to kind of explain what you
I
see?
don't know if I don't know if I've figured it out. I think it's true that a lot of the work that I've been doing, especially on YouTube or, the podcast, has been with that goal, is to help to bridge the gap and to help people understand, but not just secular or atheist people, but even some people who kind of believe in God. Sometimes they do so with a normal kind of naive, but not a naive, but something like a very simple intuition, and because of that, sometimes because they do it with a simple intuition, when they try to explain it to other people, they end up sounding ridiculous. Like they end up saying things that that freak people out. And so, one of the hopes that I've had is that some of the things that I say are able to help people who believe with that kind of simple intuition formulate it better, and help atheists also understand what it is that's going on. And there are different ways to do it. For example, I just did this speech at ARC about the idea of the good, right, in the Platonic sense, like of the capital G good, and the idea that we have to have something which transcends our desires, and that transcends all the things that we think are good. Like we have things that we think are good, like safety or family or or success, or there's all these things that we think are good, and usually that's fine. But as soon as we treat any of those things as the very highest good, then all of a sudden it becomes something like a tyrant over us, and that's obviously what someone who becomes an alcoholic is, right? It's like, yeah, you can drink with friends and it's pleasant and it's fun, but if all of a sudden you start to submit your whole world to that feeling that you get when you're drinking, then something which is fine, like which is a good, becomes a tyrant over you that starts to rule over you. And that can happen for food, it can happen for sex, it can happen for anything, like anything, even things that we find virtuous like success or whatever. And so, I try to help people say, like, that's the idea. One of the ideas that religious people have is that the good is ineffable, right? The good is something which is beyond everything you can imagine. And what that does is it's like, just don't think that whatever you're aiming at now is it. Because you can always know that it has to be embedded in something else. Even if you don't know what that is, even if you can't identify it, even if you don't go, if you don't believe that God exists, it doesn't matter. As long as you cannot hold on to something and think like, if I could just have that, then everything will be settled. And that's not true, because once you get it, either it kind of rules over you because you have to keep feeding it, or it disappoints you and then you fall into despair.
Yeah. It's also the chase, I think, that gives people more, dopamine, for lack of a better word, than actually getting to the goal. It's just chasing
That's right.
the goal.
But that's why the idea of ineffable good, like the idea that if you could, like, because people will think that if I could just get that, like you meet people like that all the time. It's like,
I'm like that sometimes.
The worst thing that could happen,
Oh yeah.
But the worst thing that could happen is that you get it, right? It's like, if you think that your life will be solved once you get $1 million, then let's talk when you get that, because you're probably gonna be pretty depressed, because it's not gonna solve your problems. You'll still be the same person. Everything, but it won't change anything. It'll just increase actually your possibly increase the problems that you had in the outset. And so this idea that at least like that whatever it is that you desire, that you're going after, is not the highest thing. That you always have to balance it out with other goods, and that you have to aim it towards higher and higher goods. Ultimately, that's love, that's good, that's true, that's beautiful. This is what the West has identified as what we call the transcendentals, and that if we can kind of aim ourselves that way, then things will get better. And I'm hoping that people, atheists and agnostics, can kind of understand now why you need this ineffable thing at the top, right? You need something which transcends everything that you can understand, transcends everything that you can grasp, or that you can control, maybe even is a good way to say it. Like, you can't control the infinite,
So how do you describe that other than the good? Do you use words like truth and love? Like,
yeah.
Is that what people should be aiming for, as opposed to? And then how do you separate the difference between goal setting, which is important, but making sure that you still have this aim towards truth and love and good at the top? Okay, because goal setting is great, trying to achieve things that aim vaguely upward, but you don't.
Well, that would be the case. The case is that if you make sure that your goal setting is aimed upward, then that will, that will help. Like if your goal is to buy a Lamborghini, then that's not going to do much for you. Like, I'm sorry to say, you will get it. Maybe you'll get it, but then what is it going to do? But if your goal is to accomplish something, for example, to be able to, your family have cohesion, right? To have loving relationships with others, to be able to help those that you see that are in need, and that, that you have to have a certain amount of success, or if you want to spread a message that you think is powerful and meaningful and can help others, all these goals can be something, like you said, that can give you that dopamine, like can give you that energy to continue to keep going. But then what will happen, hopefully, is that there's never, first of all, you never reach it, right? It's like if the idea, for example, having a loving relationship with your friends or with your family, it's like, that's a goal, but it's not a goal that has an endpoint. It's like it's actually an infinite goal. It's something that recedes as you move towards it. And you kind of love that because it's, you can always be surprised by people and kind of be stimulated. And that ultimately is the idea of, of a relationship with God, is that God pulls you into higher and higher states of virtue, states of peace, all of these things. These are the goals we should want. And material goals they're fine, but they won't bring you what you think sometimes.
Yeah. So going after success for material goods is probably a hedonistic way of living and probably not going to get you where you want. But going after success so that you can do something that benefits people as a whole, that's a different form of success.
Yeah, and also, I mean, for example, if you understand that you want to be an example for your children, you want to be an example for people around you, and you want to be disciplined, you want to do things right. All of these things are definitely good. They're all good things. And even like you said, like if you want to succeeding in business, all these things can be great, just as long as they're embedded in higher things. If they're just for their own sake, then you'll just be disappointed, because they don't have enough to it's very, people can understand it like in lower terms. Like if your entire goal in life is eating good food, then you'll always be empty, because it's not enough to sustain you as a human being. It's enough to maybe sustain the machine, but you'll find yourself lacking and always either trying to increase your pleasure, like trying to find more and more rare, more and more subtle things to enjoy. But at some point that runs out, and you become, you'll find yourself in a sad position.
How did you introduce these concepts to your kids? Have you been talking about these kind of pursuing higher good since they were little?
Yeah, but I mean, if you raise your kids, I think if you raise your kids in a Christian vision and with Christian values, if you do that, understanding that it's not just about some sectarian theological thing that you have to believe, but it's really a way of living, then ultimately I think those things will kind of set themselves into your kids on their own. For example, like a simple thing is something like that truth is important, right? Just that, because if you say truth is more important than your immediate needs, so it's not justified to lie to get what you want. It's not justified to trick others or to act in a dishonest way. Then you're already setting your kids on the right path. Just even that is a lot, so that they so that they see. But obviously, saying it is one thing. That doesn't do much. But living it, that's the way to go. Because your kids, they watch you. They don't listen to you.
Yeah.
They listen too, but they mostly watch. And so the best thing you can do as a parent is actually embody the things you believe are the best, rather than just teach them.
I think when my dad obviously like was very big on that. Like, tell the truth. There's nothing worse than lying. Whatever lie you come up with is just going to bite you in the future, and it turns your life into hell. Like he was, but I didn't really understand the impact of lying when I was little, because sometimes I'd get in trouble for doing something, and then it was easier at the time to lie to not get in trouble.
Yeah. And
so Scarlett recently, she did something. She wasn't even going to get in trouble. Like she doesn't really get in trouble. She's a pretty easy kid, but and I could tell she was lying. She just lied about something small because she thought I was going to be mad, and I had to explain, that's still not an excuse to lie. But I've also decided for like a parenting style that I don't get mad really. And maybe it's because she's little, she's 6. And so maybe you don't get mad at like kids under 6 because they're children. And I don't know if anger is the right emotion for a little kid.
Yeah.
It's more like, why did you do that? What exactly is going on? And why are you acting that way? Not like anger.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that reaction? Like, is there a time and place for like anger for kids? Because I do feel like if you have an angry parent, then they end up lying to not get punished, which is like, you don't want to teach a kid that that's the way to get away with things.
Hey guys, just popping in to remind you of air purifiers. You obviously know I talk about how important diet is, but your environment's also extremely important. And if it's not taken care of, it can override your diet and exercise results. Air Oasis is the air purifier I use, and they're having the biggest sale I've seen, up to 50% off their products, including iAdapt Air. I bought some for Scarlett's school, not on sale, before they started sponsoring me, and I have them all over my house. They've made the most powerful air purifiers I've seen that have a medical grade H13 HEPA filter that filters down to 0.003 microns, which means they trap particles 10 times smaller than most other brands. This is really important. You can't just get any old air purifier, turns out. They have germicidal UV technology to sterilize the air purifier itself and the environment. They also use a silver ion filter that penetrates the cell membrane of mold, bacteria, and viruses. It reduces pathogens by up to 99% in your air. They have 3 sizes to choose from, with the largest working at 850 square feet. I own a number of them. They're also super quiet. They come with free shipping, a lifetime warranty, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. So you can get up to 50% off your purchase by visiting airoasis.com. But if you press my link, linked in the comments, so they know I sent you, that would be much appreciated. After the 27th, it's back to 10% off with code MP. So if you were considering getting an air purifier, now is definitely the time. Links in the comments. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
I would say that anger is important. This is going to be controversial for people, but there is a reality to a certain extent in which people have to learn to have a certain amount of healthy fear of their authority, right? In the sense that if a police officer comes to arrest you, you have to know that you cannot resist arrest. Like, you have to know that you have to be polite and you have to follow along with what the authority tells you. And this is something that you learn when you're very young. So I think that with children, one of the things you can do, for example, is to reserve anger for very rare things. Because of course the problem that you have is that if you get angry all the time, that at some point it's just noise, and you see that. Like you've seen parents are just always screaming at their kids, and basically the kids have just they've learned to tune it out, and they just don't care, and they just don't listen anymore. And so I think that, if you are usually very calm and very, just very peaceful with your kids and try to explain things and to do things, I think that once in a while, if they really step out of bounds, if you raise your voice, if you just show that you're angry, then the effect of it will be very strong, and the kid will, because they know that this is not a normal thing, and if it happens, it means something really serious has happened.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right approach. I've usually reserved those situations for like, you're about to do something that's going to harm you. That's usually a thing, like playing with a mirror that's going to fall on them.
Yeah, or like a child
Stop.
Running into the street, and
Yeah.
then you see the car coming. It's like, that's a moment to scream and to take your child, shake them a little bit, and be like,
Never again.
you cannot do this. Like, you have to be scared of this moment. I have to scare you into not killing yourself, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so originally I invited you on because you put out Snow White, which is so cool. So can you talk about why did you decide to rewrite a fairy tale, re-illustrate it, and put out this beautiful book?
Well, I love fairy tales. I've loved fairy tales forever, since I was a kid. And then I rediscovered the fairy tales when I was reading the fairy tales to my children. And what I would do is I read them, and then at some point I memorized them, and then I would kind of tell them the fairy tales and try to find ways to tell them that were interesting for them.
Oh,
And
cool.
several years ago, when my kids were homeschooling, I wrote a version of Snow White as a little play that the kids were going to put on. And I really enjoyed it. And I also found I had some insights about the story, about some of the things that are a little mysterious in the narrative. And so that just kind of stayed on the shelf for a while. And then recently, when I saw to what extent, sadly, Disney was just dropping these fairy tales, like just basically dropping them. They were like, we don't want these. We actually don't like them anymore. And so I thought, okay, well, this is great because these stories are, they don't own them. The original stories, obviously they have their version, but they don't own them. They're amazing. They're beautiful. They're powerful. And, at some point there's a saturation of cynicism, you could say, right? And so one of the things that's happened is, if you think of Shrek, for example, where they take these fairy tale mashups and they turn them on their head and they're very cynical about them, and they make, they have like the kids watch them, but there's also all these like dirty jokes in them for adults and stuff. So this like real cynical take on fairy tales. So all of that runs out at some point. Because at some point you even forget why you cared about the story in the first place. Like, why are you even cynical about it after 10 years of making weird versions and, versions where the Snow White is this or that strange, incarnation of her. And so I knew that Disney was going to make a version of Snow White for the 100th anniversary. I'd kind of heard that through the grapevines. That was like more than 2 years ago. And I thought this would be a great time to do this, like to just pick it up and to tell a beautiful, insightful, celebratory version of the story. And so I kind of put my nose to that about 2 years ago. Started working hard on it and found an amazing illustrator. And I think I'm really proud of what we did. I think we did a great job of telling the story in a way that's for kids, but also that will provide kind of insight for adults as to why it is that they love this story when they were kids. Like what is it that grabbed their attention? So that's it. But it's also going to be a book in a series. So we're doing 8 fairy tales. So I'm going to take
cool.
kind of the classic fairy tales. We're going to re-illustrate them and create like also a narrative arc that runs through all the books, where like the characters will reappear and patterns will reappear, and there'll be like this kind of symphony of fairy tales, I guess you could call it. So we're already working on the second and third book now. So
That is so cool. When I was in high school, we had to, I don't know, for English, I guess, we had to bring in a piece of written work to read to the class. And I was going through Grimm's fairy tales, and I'd never read Grimm's fairy tales till high school. And for anyone who hasn't read the real like Grimm's fairy tales, they are gnarly.
they're grim. That's why we even have the word grim.
Yeah, it's insane like what actually happens in which one is it? Cinderella, just all of them. They're like gory, they're intense. And so I remember reading, I think I read the entire class, one of these random fairy tales I'd found, because it was just like, there's a lot going on here. So did you take the original fairy tales as opposed to kind of the versions Disney put out, which are a lot nicer than the original ones?
Well, so one of the things that happened with fairy tales, I would say it started in the 19th century with a kind of Puritan approach to fairy tales, is that people tried to asepticize these fairy tales. In some ways, these were old stories that have been, that people have been telling for centuries, like some old grandmother telling these edgy stories. You could just imagine the situation.
Yeah.
And so what happened in the 19th century especially is that they kind of asepticized them, removed a lot of the extremes, and made them into like simple morality tales. But the reality is that they're more than that. There's actually very deep patterns. Like their deep patterns in fairy tales are the closest thing I would say we have to something like the patterns in scripture. Right? They're not the same. They're not equal to. But in terms of how much reality they contain, they're very similar to what you would find in the Old Testament, for example. And so what I wanted to do is recapture as much as possible of the old fairy tales without going overboard, like without shocking people to the extent that now they can't pay attention to the story anymore because they're too shocked at one of the characters getting their eyes plucked out, by a bird or something. Like some of the crazy stuff, or at the end of Snow White in the Grimm's version, they make these iron shoes that they heat up, and they put them on the queen so that she dances for the wedding. It's like,
Oh my
it's just like
gosh.
insane, like these crazy, endings. There's a lot of like really intense stuff. So I thought, let's bring back as much as we can in the story. So a good example is there's obviously in fairy tales, there's obviously references to sexuality and to sexual transformation, especially the ones that deal with young girls. Like a lot of this has to do with puberty. Like you can see it has to do with like Snow White reaches puberty. She doesn't know what it means. She doesn't know what's going on. All of a sudden, her stepmother hates her. This hunter is after her. Like what the hell's going on? And she gets thrown into a loop where she has to kind of assimilate this new world that she's thrown into. So that's something that's really there. And the modern fairy tale, the Puritan version, tried to strip that out. And a lot of the cynical postmodernists tried to put it back in, but like way, at a higher level, and tried to say, well, these are only about sex. These are only about power dynamics and about cynical, kind of social dynamics and stuff. And so what I wanted to do is to actually integrate it as much as possible, to say these stories do deal with this subject, but it's not all they deal with. They deal with all kinds of other things. Like beauty is not just about sex. So the story of, beauty does have something to do with sexuality, but Snow White, obviously her beauty has other things going on that cannot be reduced to that. So trying to kind of integrate all these patterns back into the story in a way that won't shock the reader, but hopefully at least for the grown-ups, they'll be like, oh, that's why. Like, oh, that's why this is part of the story, right? That's why she eats the apple. That's why these things happen. And so that's the goal, let's say.
That's cool. I'm looking forward to these. That's really fun.
Well, you're in the right place too. Like you've got, your daughter is like just at the age where this is going to be fun for her to discover these. So I can't wait to hear what you think.
I know. I wanted to read her. I've been like waiting for the Grimm's versions, but I remember the Grimm's version, Rumpelstiltskin. He gets so angry at the end. You probably know this. He stamps his foot through the floorboards and cuts himself in half. I remember reading that in high school and being like, okay, well, I haven't heard that part of the story. Or was Cinderella's stepsisters, they cut off parts of their feet.
They cut off their toes, yeah. I might keep that part in the story, actually.
Yeah? Like one does the heel and one does the toes?
Yeah.
Oh.
I might keep that part in the story especially because of the recent excess of plastic surgery. It's like it's a big thing in the culture, and so I want people to be able to understand the dangers of it. Like if you cut piece, and even in terms of cutting things off you in order to fit a certain mold, let's say, you see that with the mastectomies and all this kind of crazy things that are happening to young teenage girls right now. So I think having the stepsisters cut their toes off will be important. I'll have to find a way to do it so that it's not gory and crazy, but I think these things are important, So like there's a lot of these fairy tales, there's a lot of things they can communicate to us. For example, in Snow White, the magic mirror, there are some versions where she has the magic mirror in her hand. And that the illustrator that's working with me, Heather Pollington, she's like, we should use that version that she holds it in her hand. And she made an illustration of it. And it's like she's holding a phone, right? She's just looking at herself and she's taking a selfie, And we're like, yeah, that's exactly it. And so the phone, the mirror is speaking to her and is comparing her to others and is telling her who's the most beautiful and is pointing out her faults and her beauty. And it's like, yeah, that's right. That's the right time to bring up these kind of story tropes.
Oh, that's creepy.
Yeah, well.
So are you putting a modern spin on these then?
Well, so you could say that it's there. I'm careful not to be like, we say these things. I don't explain any of this in the story. It's not like I don't want it to be didactic. It's not. But I would say that the way that we make certain elements of the story more prominent, that's the way we do it. So it's like, making the mirror prominent, making these moments where she looks at herself and she kind of gets feedback from it, and she becomes obsessed at some point in my version, where she can't stop herself from looking in the mirror and constantly asking it if it's, and as she's doing that, she's kind of destroying herself. She's destroying herself because of her jealousy towards Snow White. And so it's like, I'm hoping that people, even if it's not conscious, will kind of they'll be able to gather those insights into themselves, and children will see the pattern of behavior, even though I never say that it's like a phone, or that's, I would never do so, like that would be horrible in a fairy tale. It would just be so didactic.
The best versions of those fairy tales, other than the Grimm's versions, which are just horrifying, are the old Disney versions from like, what is it, the 30s
Yeah,
until
the Disney movie was
like
amazing.
90s.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are amazing.
the Disney Snow White, it's not just, it's weird because the Disney story of Snow White, it's really the beginning of a whole era, because people don't realize that it's the very first long form animated movie ever made is Disney Snow White. People didn't believe that it was possible. People were like, you can't make an hour and a half animation, right? Animation should be 10 minutes or should be these little clips. But Disney really took it on and made this amazing, and invented all these technologies, all these new ways of animating in order to develop this movie. And people were just amazed at it. And it started a whole, like an entire century where basically Disney held children's attention and kind of ruled over children's attention. And for a while, they were good stewards of that attention because the stories they put out were very powerful and beautiful. And they also had that balance, that your father, or that I talk about, that should be in a kind of mythical story where you have everything is there and kind of balanced out. But then, they, like a lot of the entertainment industry, they become captured by ideology, and ideology makes for boring stories. So it's actually, and the same happening in books too. I mean, you have a child, that you go into a bookstore to buy books for kids, and it's just unbearable. Like, it's crap. It's just bad quality, bad writing, ideology everywhere. It's like you always have to kind of look twice at what your kid is reading, because it's so insipid. There's people just trying to get into your child's mind in order to convert them to their cause, that you have to be attentive to that. And so in some ways, that's a horrible place that a lot of parents find themselves in, but it's also an opportunity for people who want to tell good stories. Because in a moment of really bad, horrible, boring ideological stories, then good stories should shine brighter. And so I would say encourage people to, it's okay to criticize. I do it all the time, but not just criticize, but hopefully, take on the mantle yourself, learn the stories, tell them to your kids, encourage people that are doing it. And I think that we're going to win in the end, because there's a reality to these stories that is objective, that there's a reason why we care for them. There's a reason why we love them for centuries, is because they have something mysterious in them that is true to human attention, that is true to what people care about. Even if we don't understand what that is, it's still there because we've been telling these stories for centuries. So if you try to go away from that to just push your ideological ideas, then people will just stop caring. They'll just find it boring. And that's what's happening.
Isn't it crazy how much J.K. Rowling has been gone after in the last 4 years? Isn't it insane for a book that everybody who's going after her read
and loves
15 and loves? It's like, that really shocks me. Even the response, and Twitter's, X now, is such a weird and could be toxic platform, but it just shocks me, the response to J.K. Rowling, who wrote these stories that are unbelievable.
Yeah,
about
it's
good
interesting.
And evil.
This is what happens. Even with this is what happened with Snow White, and this is what happened with Harry Potter. Is that these stories have in them true patterns of human existence, and those patterns have certain structures, certain categories that just play themselves out. And if you catch them right, then people love those stories. That's why people love Star Wars. That's why people love these stories. But those are real. They really do exist. And so the weird position people find themselves in is loving Harry Potter because it basically captures the patterns of human attention, but then at the same time hating Harry Potter because they're caught up in their ideological thing. And what they want is that they hope is that they could twist Harry Potter to their will. They could make Harry Potter into something that would fit their ideology. And obviously they're trying to do that with the author first. It's like, if we can just shame the author into believing the things we believe and going along with what we think is true, then we'll win and we'll have Harry Potter on our side. But the problem is that the Harry Potter that would come out of that, you would hate it. You would find it boring. You would find it annoying because it would just be propaganda. And so it's like this weird moment that it's like the J.K. Rowling thing is a great example of how insane and contradictory this is, because it's like you love Star Wars and then you're like, oh, this is so cool. We're going to take it over and we're going to just make it fit in this beautiful political thing. And then why does everybody hate the movies? Why is it that these things are all failing? That's how it is. It's just, it's just funny.
It is funny. How do you feel? So my husband grew up in a very Christian household and his family's really like they're all really good people, which I feel like I didn't meet very many really good people, weirdly enough. I guess, I don't know if they're not very common or something. I don't know what was going on or the schools I was at or something. So I was like surprised at how good they were. But he didn't watch Harry Potter growing up because there was this, and I remember hearing about this when I was in grade 2, where it was like, there's a subset of people that think Harry Potter's evil.
Yeah.
And mostly like Christian people that think, it's witchcraft and that's evil. What are your views on that? And how do you, well, I know what my views are on that. I probably know what your views are on that. But like, how come that got confused into, oh, that's evil, instead of looking at the overarching theme of like good versus evil that's in Harry Potter?
Okay, so Christians don't like witchcraft and don't like magic, but those same Christians they'll read Lord of the Rings and they'll love Lord of the Rings, right? And so those same Christians will read C.S. Lewis and they'll love C.S. Lewis. But in those books, like in Lord of the Rings, basically Lord of the Rings is the template for all fantasy fiction that we have. And so the idea of sorcerers and all this kind of stuff that Tolkien was able to bring together crystallized a kind of medieval mythology, you could say, of Merlin and all of these kind of characters that existed in the West into modern narrative. And that became the background and the trope for everything that came afterwards, including Harry Potter. And so it's like you like Gandalf, but you hate Dumbledore. It's like, I understand. And so but I think it's so you could say that in Lord of the Rings, the magic is meant to serve a higher purpose, right? It's like the things we do, this power that we have, is meant to serve higher and higher purposes. And the problem with kind of modern magic or occultist magic is that magic is meant to serve your will. And I think that this is, in some ways, the problem that people face when they look at Harry Potter. It's like magic is just like a bunch of technical things. It's just like an increase in power. And it's not clear whether or not it is meant to serve a higher good. It's just like, here's a power you have, you can develop it, and you can kind of develop all the technical skills around it. So I think that that's what's hiding behind that. But on the surface, it's just like, witchcraft is devil worship, and they relate the occult to kind of Satanism or witchcraft, the way that it was represented in the in the 16th, 17th century in Europe. So I understand people's aversion to Harry Potter. Like, I get it. But I think that it's a little simple, let's say. I still think that in general they're good stories.
Okay, how do you feel about Halloween then, and the aversion of Halloween?
This is really, I think Halloween's a good example of what you could call a Puritan spirit taken too far, which is, this is the same type of attitude that took all the weird stuff out of the fairy tales, which is this idea that everything has to have this kind of transparent purity to it, and everything has to be, objectively, how can I say this? Like, objectively always, like I could just say that, transparently pure, right? But the reality is that the world doesn't work that way. It's like it just doesn't. The world is more complicated and more messy than you think. And for carnivals and festivals of inversion are everywhere and in every culture.
What's a festival? A festival of inversion?
Yeah, an upside down festival, right? So a carnival is something like that. So think about, during a carnival, you do things that you usually don't do. You dress up, you wear masks, you you usually there's acrobatics involved, people spinning and turning upside down and making jokes and pulling tricks and doing all these things that are not straightforward. It's like, you have things that are straightforward and directed towards purpose and identity. And then you also have a kind of messiness and inversion and upside down behavior that you can notice on the edge. And that's what carnivals of inversions are. And every culture has them. So usually like before a fast, before Lent for Christians, they would have something called Mardi Gras, which you've probably seen Mardi Gras parades. Obviously now they've become crazy, but they've always been a little bit like that. They've always been a little, a little off color, lewd, maybe a little. There's a bit of, there's cross-dressing and funny things that don't make sense. People on stilts or, all this kind of aesthetic. You could call it an aesthetic of chaos or an aesthetic of inversion. And that serves a function in a society, right? So basically you have order, right? You have the ordered world that everything is ordered and purposeful and moving towards what it's supposed to be. But then you know that those things exist, right? You know that there are messy, chaotic things, and there are monsters, and there are places where things don't fit, and inversions and excesses and all that, And so carnival festivals basically take them out to play for one day and then put them back, right? And what that does is it acts like a valve, first of all, to let some of that stuff out because it builds up after a while. And it also acts as a reminder of what's normal, right? It's like a counterexample. It's saying, this is carnival, all right? Let's have fun now for a day and let's be a little wild. And now let's go back to normal. So it's like, oh, that's what normal is. And that's what not normal is. So you kind of understand how that works. And Halloween, that's what Halloween is. I mean, Halloween is basically, a day of the dead where the dead walk the earth, which is something that doesn't happen, it means that all the broken, kind of monstrous, chaotic, funny, slightly sexy, slightly, like all the things that we don't usually put outside in the world, now all of a sudden they come out and we see them and we're like, wow, this is crazy, this is wild. It's kind of like going to a county fair and going on, and looking all the bright lights and all the people dressed up and the clowns and all that. So that's what's going on. And then it's like, all right, one day, and then we go back to normal. And so, this, by the way, in the Bible, there's a feast called Purim, which is there. It's a Jewish feast, and Jews still celebrate it today, where one day a year they dress up and costumes and do all this kind of wild stuff, and they spin around and they drink and they dance and they do all these things, but it's just one day. So.
And that's something God is that something God's put in place for people?
That's what Purim is, that exactly. And that's what so obviously you have to be careful on those days, because you could do something to compromise yourself, and that you want to be careful. Like in some ways it can also expose you. It can expose your vices if you're not careful. And so the idea is to basically kind of get a bit of wild out so you can see it, so you can kind of handle it in a way that's not completely immoral or completely dangerous, and then put it back and then move on. Because if you don't do that, what happens is at some point it breaks out and then it takes over, right? If you don't know what the monsters look like and you don't understand what the chaos looks like, at some point it just basically sweeps in.
I think a lot of, that I didn't know. What part of the Bible is that in? Do you remember?
So the Feast of Purim is established. It's complicated. It's established in the Book of Esther.
Oh,
the Book of Esther so the Book of Esther is basically like a kind of almost like a liturgical text for Purim. And so in the I don't know exactly what date the Feast of Purim was established, but it's Jews, like I said, Jews still celebrate Purim today. Most Christians don't, though. Most Christians have something like Mardi Gras, or in the past they've had something like the Feast of Fools. And then Hallows Eve, right? And so if you want to look at how Halloween functions, what it actually is, it's actually a Catholic, it's the Eve of All Hallows, right? That's what Halloween means. And so what it was in the past is that All Hallows was the day that you celebrated, that you prayed for the dead, right? And then after that was All Saints, which is the day that you celebrated all those that have passed that are now in God's presence. And so then what ended up being developed was before All Hallows, there was like a little carnival in some ways in which the more chaotic aspects of death and the more kind of, wild aspects of what death brings, and the strange and the weird and the trick and all of these things that kind of break down order, so that we can move towards something like a celebration of the holy saints that have gone to God. So that was the usual order of things. Sadly, now we just have Halloween, but we can still understand its function if you can see how it lines up with those other feasts and how it was like a kind of procession towards something glorious, not just a feast of the upside down. I mean, now the problem is that we basically live in Halloween all the time. It's like our world is a carnival. That's why people say it's clown world, is because the carnival has basically taken over.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people who aren't Christians are probably put off by the idea of Christianity, thinking that, oh, if the goal is to never sin, then I won't be able to do anything fun ever. I can see that from an agnostic perspective. Like, it's a simple perspective, but I don't think they understand that. Like, even factions of Christianity that say don't drink ever because drinking is bad, or don't use electricity, or, who knows, like, what direction people can go in. But that's not what I got out of the Bible anyway.
No, I don't think so.
I don't know how.
No,
it's like what you were talking
really
about
is,
Puritans.
Yeah, it really is the idea that the joys we have and the pleasures we have should always be aligned towards higher goods. And if we're not careful about that, then we kind of fall into these cycles of addiction and these cycles of obsession. And so, the idea that in some way, and it depends how strict the different traditions are, but in some way sexuality has to be aimed towards something higher. And so, right, you meet someone, and then there's all the pleasure is there and the joy is there, but it's also towards a purpose of forming a bond, forming communion, bringing a child into the world, becoming a family, seeing that beautiful relationship that develops, and being a little kind of microcosm of everything, like being a little society that you live in. That's the highest. That's moving towards highest. And so it's like, there's nothing wrong with sex and enjoying that, as long as it's kind of anchored in something more. If it's just for itself, then you have hookup culture and despair and people who just kind of move from one partner to the other, and then finally, basically ruin their lives and end up alone and lonely in their 40s or whatever. And I think, and so that's just an example, but that's true of everything, right? It's like the joys that we have. It's a weird paradox, but the idea is that whatever joy you have, if you are willing to, in some ways, submit it to something higher, sacrifice it for something higher, then you get it in its fullness, right? It's like a meal with friends in which you're enjoying each other's presence will be more pleasurable, right, than the best food you could have that you got up at 1 a.m. out of an insane craving, and you're like just eating the best food in quotation marks. That will not provide you with a higher joy. But if you do it, if you're with friends and it's like this thing that's kind of participating in higher goods, then you'll get the most of it. And that's the paradox of pleasure, you could say.
What are your views on the red pill bros push towards polygamy? Like, I didn't even hear what polygamy was until I was 15. Like, I didn't even know people thought like that anymore, but I wasn't aware of different cultures around the world. I was much more naive.
You mean the idea of having several wives?
Yeah, why is this? Have you heard this? It's in the red pill community that they're like,
I'm sure it exists. I'm not surprised that it would exist. These guys are all going to become Muslim, like they're just moving towards Islam. Christianity has been from the beginning a monogamous thing, and it's there in the words of Christ that ultimately the joining of a duality, right, the joining of two opposites together, that is the highest image of what, let's say, of the union of the person with God. And so the marriage, as two people coming together and becoming one, that becomes an image of our relationship with God. And so, the idea of polygamy, let's say, reduces the relationship between men and women as something like a master and servants, ultimately, is what that does. And I think that is, at least in the Christian vision, that is not what we're called to, right? It's like we're actually called, God is our master, but God is also seen as our lover, as seen as the one that wants to bring our life into his, so that we can participate fully in his joy, in his love. And that's why Christianity is monogamous, because it's not just a submit to the higher principle thing, although it's part of it, but it's not just that. It really is this kind of dance where we move into a true relationship and a true union with God.
That was pretty.
Does that make
That
sense?
was
That
pretty
in some ways
nice.
it,
Yeah.
yeah. But that's why in certain traditions it's still permissible, and it's usually because that is the way they perceive reality, and that's the way they perceive God as well.
Okay, that makes sense. I just thought it was funny that it's kind of permeating into the red pill Western culture. Like I would say most people who consider them red pilled on YouTube, what they preach is polygamy, blatantly, because they said
Really?
that's just the way of men who are very dominant. It's to have 12 wives, and that's just how it's supposed to be naturally from evolution. That's what
Yeah.
they say.
Yeah. Well, and I think so. Let's look at it objectively. Like let's look at it objectively. The greatest, even in terms of total red pill. Let me take a red pill position here for a moment. It's like the empires that have been the most powerful and have lasted the longest and have had the most reach, you could say. Let's say Rome, for example. Rome was mainly monogamous in its structure, although there was a kind of practical polygamy where guys would probably sleep around and stuff. But like there was a main monogamy in terms of social structure, and then Christianity takes that even further, and then let's say there's a reason why the West expanded it to become almost a global influence, and monogamy is part of that, because it is ultimately the best bond and the best way to raise children that will have the strength and the capacity to take over from you if there is that strong bond and that strong relationship. At least that's what I think. So I think that even in terms of let's say even in terms of the red pill bros that try to look at it just purely in terms of material causes, they should take into account the reason why the West developed in this direction, and not think that it's purely accidental, that there are actual reasons why that happened.
They probably just put themselves at the top and they're like, nah, I'm the outlier though. I can do
that's
it.
the thing. That's the thing about all these guys that's hilarious, is like you think that's right, but then you think you're going to be the one with the 12 wives, or you're just going to be the eunuch who's castrated and is protecting the harem. It's like, that's not a, it's not a great, it's just funny that people always think that they're going to be at the top, when like you see that in a lot of people that are that have a tendency towards monarchism. Sometimes you talk to them and you realize it's because, you think you're going to be the king. That's why you have that position.
That's funny. Yes, that's exactly it though. That's definitely it. Oh, that's good. Okay. Well, Jonathan, it was nice talking to you. I'm really excited about your books. I think they'll be so good for people. I'm definitely getting them all.
Oh, thanks. Okay, yeah, I can't wait to hear what you think when you get them. I'll be wonderful.
I'm like, where's the gore? No.
Yeah.
Just kidding. No, I'm sure it'll be good. It'll be good if I can read them to Scarlett and there's not too much gore.
There's a little bit of gore.
Okay, good.
But not a lot.
Just to keep things spicy.
There is blood. You can't have Snow White without a bit of blood.
Oh, wow. Okay. That sounds good. Well, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.